Derrida, Nihilism, Relativism, and Atheism. This is Son of Freedom. Purpose of this study: to examine Jacques Derrida's philosophy of language and assess its contribution to nihilism, cultural relativism, and atheism. Here's my source. I'm only going to be using this one book of his. I think this is his magnum opus. My approach: I do not see an obvious linearity of Derrida's thought. I will try to clarify some of Derrida's major concepts in no particular order. Then I will assess the implications of his philosophy of language for nihilism, cultural relativism, and atheism. A good background study for understanding Derrida is Ludwig Wittgenstein, who was writing in the around 1950, early 50s. Wittgenstein is also a philosopher of language, although he treats philosophy as if it has nothing to do with metaphysics. It is in fact anti-metaphysical, and it is philosophy, and had enormous influence. Okay, elements of Derrida's philosophy of language. Situating Derrida's conversation with previous philosophers. Derrida is interacting with the ideas of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, G.W.F. Hegel, F. Nietzsche, E. Husserl, M. Heidegger, Claude Lévi-Strauss, Ferdinand de Saussure, and Roland Barthes, and others. His project is to understand how meaning is generated. What is the relationship of language to meaning? How firmly fixed are meanings? Derrida begins with the structuralism of Lévi-Strauss and de Saussure and moves beyond them to a new position that came to be called post-structuralism, also known as Post-Modernism. How does post-structuralism differ from structuralism? Both structuralism and post-structuralism contain the idea that language does not point outside itself. Language does not have to reference anything outside of itself to generate meaning, and it cannot reference outside of itself. In both, we are seeing a denial that meaning has its source in nature or an author out there. Language is merely self-referential. In both, meaning does not depend on any human agency such as an author. So now we see that language loses its human agency, and this is something that shows up a lot in downstream in later philosophy. But post-structuralism goes beyond structuralism in that post-structuralism denies any depth model of meaning. Under structuralism, you could still use the so-called deep structures of language to get at the true meaning of a text. So there is a true meaning under structuralism still. Derrida, as a post-structuralist, denies that meaning exists prior to language, that language is capable of representing meaning, which exists independent of language in Platonic heaven. Derrida calls this a metaphysics of presence. Knowledge reducible to the type of language used. For Derrida, knowledge is not some type of possession of something out there in the world. Instead, what we think of as knowledge is just language. For example, under post-structuralism, science becomes merely a style of discourse, in the same way that law becomes a style of discourse, in the same way that medicine becomes a style of discourse. And you find that a lot in so-called science studies. And it starts really, I think, with Kuhn, Thomas Kuhn, because Thomas Kuhn, even though he was trained as a physicist, he comes to the conclusion in his theory of paradigms that the choice between paradigm A and paradigm B doesn't really turn on evidence. It turns on the values of the scientific community, and since those values are arbitrary, then you cannot speak in any kind of meaningful sense that science progresses or closes in on a true account of the world. In each domain of language, the only thing that distinguishes a field that certain phenomena come into the foreground and other phenomena fall into the background. Now, I know this may sound crazy to you, but according to Derrida's philosophy of language, you could say that the only difference between brain surgery and underwater basket weaving is that one brings certain facts into the foreground and leaves others in the background, and the other one brings another set of facts into the foreground and another set of facts into the background. That's the only difference. I know it sounds crazy, but that is actually Derrida's position. By phenomena is meant perceptions. There are no natural objects out there, only perceptions and phenomena. Now, I think this preoccupation by Derrida with phenomena comes from his spending a lot of time studying Husserl and to a lesser extent Heidegger. Presence, the unwarranted assumption that Western forms of knowledge are built up on certain centers, origins, or foundations. So this is the definition of presence according to Derrida. Derrida says that the idea that presence is real is an illusion. This would be one of the sources of anti-foundationalism that we find in postmodernism. Logocentrism. This is the false assumption that words transparently transmit meaning from the mind of a speaker or writer to the mind of a listener or reader. Logocentrism is based on the metaphysics of presence, which Derrida says is an illusion. Quote, logocentrism is the metaphysics of phonetic writing, for example, the alphabet, which was fundamentally for enigmatic yet essential reasons that are inaccessible to a simple historical relativism, nothing but the most original and powerful ethnocentrism in the process of imposing itself upon the world, controlling in one and the same order, 1, the concept of writing, 2, the history of metaphysics, and 3, the concept of science. So he's saying that logocentrism is a type of historical relativism. Or I should say it's a type of ethnocentrism. It's actually the ethnocentrism of the West. So it's actually a veiled or indirect attack on the West. Logocentrism is the process of imposing a metaphysics on phonetic writing. This metaphysics is always ethnocentric, and its function is to impose control in the domains of 1, the concept of writing, 2, the history of metaphysics, and 3, in our understanding of science. Derrida says that logocentrism controls the concept of writing in a world where the phoneticization of writing must dissimulate its own history as it is produced. I interpret this to be saying that phonetic writing, i.e. an alphabet, erases its history of development and creates an artificial sense of objectivity. Peirce goes very far in the direction that I have called deconstruction of the transcendental signified, which at one time or another would place a reassuring end to the reference from sign to sign. I have identified logocentrism and the metaphysics of presence as the exigent, powerful, systematic, and irrepressible desire for such a signified. The so-called thing in itself, Ding an sich in the German, is always already a representation shielded from the simplicity of intuitive evidence. The representamen functions only by giving rise to an interpretant that itself becomes a sign, and so on to infinity. And Derrida likes to use a lot of Latin, and he also likes to use a lot of neologisms. Logocentrism, the metaphysics of phonetic writing, imposes upon the world through the history of the only metaphysics assign the origin of truth to the logos. The history of truth, of the truth, of truth, has always been the debasement of writing and its repression outside full speech. Logocentrism is another name for the ontotheology which enables language to refer to things in the world. The book of nature and God's writing, especially in the Middle Ages, all that functions as metaphor in these discourses, confirms the privilege of the logos and founds the literal meaning then given to writing, a sign signifying a signifier itself, signifying an eternal verity, eternal through and spoken in the proximity of a present logos. I know it sounds like spaghetti, but just try to hang in there and just let it process in your brain subconsciously what he's trying to say. I found that was the easiest way to understand Derrida, is to just kind of put it in your mind and let it percolate, and then read other things of his, and then let it all kind of come together and get naturally integrated in your brain. Derrida sees it as his mission to enable us to get over this habit of thought. From the moment that there is meaning, there are nothing but signs. We think only in signs, which amounts to ruining the notion of the sign at the very moment when, as in Nietzsche, the exigency is recognized in the absoluteness of its right. One could call play the absence of the transcendental signified as limitlessness of play, that is to say, as the destruction of ontotheology and the metaphysics of presence. Reading Derrida is a lot like reading Hegel. It's a lot of gibberish. Logocentrism, controlling the concept of science or the scientificity of science, what has always been determined as logic, a concept that has always been a philosophical concept, even if the practice of science has constantly challenged its imperialism of the logos by invoking, for example, from the beginning and ever increasingly non-phonetic writing. I interpret this to mean that science is an example of logocentrism at work. The logocentrism of science is seen in the creating of a metaphysics of presence where there is none. He seems to suggest that science is reducible to logic, that the use of non-phonetic writing, for example math, masks the logocentrism at work in science. He seems to be suggesting in this that science commits the crime of the metaphysics of presence, meaning it claims to give us access to the world when in fact it doesn't. This is a deep skepticism. It is written by someone who probably has no experience as a scientist. Infinitivist theologies are always logocentrisms, whether they are creationisms or not. Spinoza himself said of the understanding, or logos, that it was the immediate, infinite mode of the divine substance, even calling it its eternal Son in the short treatise. So now here he's hinting that logos is the understanding, but he's also suggesting that the logos depends on the existence of God to validate that understanding through the metaphysics of presence. In an original and non-relativist sense, logocentrism is an ethnocentric metaphysics. It is related to the history of the West. The Chinese model only apparently interrupts it when Leibniz refers to it to teach the characteristic. Theological implications of anti-logocentrism. In the New Testament, Jesus is said to be the Logos tou theou, the Logos, the Word of God. Jesus as God incarnate shows us how God is. This is according to Christian theology. If it is the case, as Derrida says, that words cannot refer to things beyond themselves, then the human mind has no access to reality. The phenomena we perceive are just phenomena. We cannot translate these phenomena into statements with any truth status. This immediately destroys science, but it also destroys theology. If logocentrism is based on a metaphysics of presence, and metaphysics of presence is invalid, then logocentrism is invalid, and epistemologically it would be meaningless to speak of Jesus as the Word of God or as conveying knowledge of the Creator. But more than that, Derrida's rejection of the metaphysics of presence means that physics equations cannot describe the world, and mathematical theorems cannot describe mathematical truths in Platonic heaven. Also, we cannot really know if we are communicating with other minds since they are metaphysical posits. If you've ever read something like God and Other Minds, the name of the philosopher escapes me. Let me go look it up. Yes, the name of that author is Alvin Plantinga, and he has a book entitled God and Other Minds. And it's an argument, more or less, for the existence of God based on the fact that we believe that when we speak to people, we are engaging with another mind, right? But a mind is a very ethereal thing, but we still believe that we are talking to people genuinely, right? So when we deny that we have access to words, then we are also denying that we have access to other minds, and we are then denying that we have access to God. All right. So let's continue. If logocentrism is based on a metaphysics of presence, and metaphysics of presence is invalid, then logocentrism is invalid, and epistemologically it would be meaningless to speak of Jesus as the Word of God or as conveying knowledge of the Creator. But more than that, Derrida's rejection of the metaphysics of presence means that physics equations cannot describe the world, and mathematical theorems cannot describe mathematical truths in Platonic heaven. Also, we cannot really know if we are communicating with other minds since they are metaphysical posits. Okay, I read that much. All of this comes from the atheism of Nietzsche, Husserl, and Heidegger. So he's dependent on those three writers, and I don't want to go into those writers, but if you have a deep grasp of those three writers, you can see where Derrida is coming from. Okay, grammatology. Grammatology is Derrida's neologism for his new science of writing. Grammatology is a neologism whose purpose is to free writing from metaphysics, metaphor, and theology. Derrida believes that his grammatology will liberate writing. Here, one must think of writing as a game within language. Derrida sees grammatology as an extension of semiology, the theory of signs. Derrida says that although semiology is more general than linguistics, semiology has historically been regarded as a subset of linguistics. Regarding semiology as a subset of linguistics has contributed to linguistics being dominated by logocentric metaphysics, according to Derrida. Derrida sees Barthes as being one of the first who saw that writing must be allowed to stand alone as a system of signification independent of speech. You know, in our traditional understanding, we think that, especially in phonetic writing, we think that spoken words came first and then writing followed that. But Derrida is actually denying that historical progression. Through all the recent work in the area, one glimpses the future extensions of a grammatology called upon to stop receiving its guiding concepts from other human sciences, or what nearly always amounts to the same thing, from traditional metaphysics. Grammatology ought not to be one of the sciences of man, because it asks first, as its characteristic question, the question of the name of man. Indeed, one must understand this incompetence of science, which is also the incompetence of philosophy, the closure of the episteme, this unnameable movement of difference itself that I have strategically nicknamed trace, reserve, or difference, could be called writing only within the historical closure, that is to say, within the limits of science and philosophy. In a certain sense, thought means nothing. Like all openings, this index belongs within a past epoch by the face that is open to view. This thought has no weight. It is, in the play of the system, that very thing which never has weight. Deconstruction, the process by which post-structuralism shows that previously believed natural kinds or structures or foundations are mere illusions. Inside-outside, the idea that all coherence is imposed by the author. The author decides what to include and what to leave out. This means that coherence is an illusion. We could say that Derrida's concept of inside-outside is his way of deconstructing coherence. The neophyte to postmodern theory learns that postmodernism is anti-foundational, but Derrida goes beyond that to say that even coherence itself is a social construct. This idea suggests that the world is much more messy and incoherent than most people would think. It is only because of authorial selectivity that there exists any coherence. This idea is most likely a major source of what came to be called constructivism or social construction. In other words, the idea that there is coherence in the world is an illusion. This concept greatly contributes to nihilism in Western thought. And this concept of inside-outside, I think, also comes from Wittgenstein, because as I recall, Wittgenstein treats this same topic, and Wittgenstein is writing around 20 years earlier. Supplementarity, the artificial addition of features to language which lead to logocentrism. Metaphysics of presence, a metaphysics that assumes the existence of something which in the end does not exist. For example, the idea of objectivity is an illusion because it assumes neutrality of observation or reason that does not exist. It should be clear that followed to its logical conclusion, this would result in the destruction of science. Essence, meaning, cause, and self are examples of fictions created by the metaphysics of presence. So, pause for a second and look at those 4 words and think about them. These are words that we bandy about all the time. And we think that we know what they mean. And Derrida is telling us that they are empty because the metaphysics of presence itself is invalid. And so therefore, words like these 4 words are meaningless. And think about that. What would that mean for your worldview if you could no longer use those 4 words because they are empty words? And so I would call this an example of nihilism at work. This is why Derrida can say there is only the text. Following Derrida, Rorty later says there are only narratives all the way down. My translation, there are no foundations of knowledge. This is a core thesis of postmodernism and has enormous implications for society. This explains the deep skepticism now dominating the West. Author intention. For Derrida, writing is not transparent. Writing is not a window to the mind of the author. All we have is a text. What we see in a text is what we bring to a text. This would explain why in university English departments the student is now presented with many different types of hermeneutics. It is because if there is no author intention, then the text in the end just says what your hermeneutic makes it say, or your hermeneutic determines the range of possible outcomes of meaning. And in previous videos, I've talked about how in Western universities now, English departments are now taken over by various methods of Marxist hermeneutics. And this part of the reason why is because of Derrida. Transparency of language is an illusion in Derrida. Every text involves the selection of words, and so every text has the potential of meaning many different things depending on the choice of words and on the meanings that the reader associates with those words. All texts are opaque, and we only have texts. Speech is also a type of text in Derrida's philosophy. Derrida denies that the fact that writing phonetically represents the sounds of speech gives speech priority. Renouncing it, phonology must indeed renounce all the distinctions between writing and the spoken word. Différence, I guess that's how it's pronounced in the French. And this is a neologism. This is the idea that the meaning of words are not built on anything in the world. Words are not anchored to anything. This is a very radical doctrine, and try to pay attention to this. They are only defined in relation to other words. That is, their meaning is deferred until other words are defined, or in how they differ from other words. So différence deliberately has this double meaning, or double entendre in the French. So think about language, like if you have a language that you've mastered, think of a language as a web of words, and all of these words are interconnected. And so in order to define any one word, you have to contrast it from other words that it doesn't mean, or it means different from, or it has a distinction from. And that's all you have. You don't have a word anchored to anything in the world, or even in Platonic heaven. For example, binary oppositions help us to see difference at work. Think of high culture versus mass culture. We are accustomed to associating high culture with something superior. Mass culture is something inferior. Derrida also uses the examples good/evil, east/west, civilized/primitive, us/them. In each case, one pole of the binary depends on the other pole. See, in other words, each pole is not anchored to something foundational. It's connected to the other pole, and so it's just floating, right? It's freestanding. It's not anchored to anything else. Différence is a concept which has useful applications in post-colonialism and feminism. I won't break that out for you. Since the relative value associated with each pole of a binary is arbitrary, then this leads to relativism. The linguistic signifier is not in essence phonic, but incorporeal, constituted not by its material substance, but the differences that separate its sound image from all others. The idea or phonic substance that a sign contains is of less importance than the other signs that surround it. Okay, deconstruction. The rationality which governs a writing thus enlarged and radicalized no longer issues from a logos. Further, it inaugurates the destruction, not the demolition, but the desedimentation, the deconstruction of all the significations that have their source in that of the logos, particularly the signification of truth. Take note of that. To state this in simpler language, deconstruction is a method within postmodern theory, also called post-structuralism, which shows that all metaphysics and epistemological foundations upon closer inspection are illusory. Postmodernism is called post-structuralism because the structuralists de Saussure and Levi-Strauss held out hope that the accessibility to the world could still be found in the so-called deep structures of language. Post-structuralism denies that such deep structures exist. An analogy would be the theory of relativity in physics. Relativity tells us that there is no preferred reference frame. Post-structuralism likewise tells us that there are no foundations of truth and meaning. Priority of speech over writing. This is the classical view, not Derrida's view. Derrida cites Aristotle as one of the first to believe in the priority of speech, the phone, over writing. In Aristotle, speech represents the idea and writing represents speech, so that speech is closer to the thing, the res. And I guess that's the Latin. The written word for Aristotle always referred to something else. It was not self-referencing. In the thought of medieval theology, which is based on Aristotelian metaphysics, the word as image, the eidos, was only able to represent a thing, a race, because it was based on the logos in the mind of God. Derrida's criticism of logocentrism is an attack on this notion, which had assumed that the ability of words to reference things is grounded in metaphysics which depended on God. Priority of writing, now Derrida's position. Quote, I would wish rather to suggest that the alleged derivativeness of writing, however real and massive, was possible only on one condition, that the original, natural, etc. language had never existed, never been intact and untouched by writing, that it itself had always been a writing. Derrida calls the thing from which writing is derived not speech, but arch writing. This arch writing, although its concept is invoked by the themes of the arbitrariness of the sign and of difference, cannot and can never be recognized as the object of a science. It is that very thing which cannot let itself be reduced to the form of presence. The latter orders all objectivity of the object and all relation of knowledge. This means that Derrida, while denying that writing has a metaphysical presence, still wants to ground writing in his own metaphysical posit, which he calls arch writing, which he puts beyond accessibility to science. If it is inaccessible to science, then it is metaphysics. It is his own metaphysics, and this is something that he doesn't admit to, that he's actually doing metaphysics. Or we could call it anti-metaphysics. Signified versus signifier. Derrida wishes to end our misunderstanding of the artificial dichotomy of signified versus signifier. He says that the signified versus signifier distinction depends on ontotheology. Quote, the difference between signified and signifier belongs in a profound and implicit way to the totality of the great epoch covered by the history of metaphysics, and in a more explicit and more systematically articulated way to the narrower epoch of Christian creationism and infinitism, when these appropriate the resources of Greek conceptuality. This appurtenance is essential and irreducible. One cannot retain the convenience or the scientific truth of the Stoic and later medieval opposition between signans and signatum without also bringing with it all its metaphysico-theological roots. End quote. Derrida is saying that we must overthrow this tradition of building meaning on ontotheology and reconstruct meaning on some other basis. Derrida's erasure of the distinction between signifier and signified is at least partially derived from Heidegger's metaphysics. priority of writing over speech, which is counterintuitive. While Derrida admits that we learn to speak before we learn to write, and while Derrida admits that writing clothes speech, he describes writing as a type of violence. He says that language is first writing. In contrast to other linguists, Derrida denies that writing is the sign of a sign. That is, that writing is the sign of the spoken word, and that the spoken word is the sign of the thing in itself, the Ding an sich. Derrida says that phonetic, alphabetic writing is associated with logocentrism, and logocentrism preempts a consideration of the origin and status of writing. Derrida points out that Saussure, as a structuralist, never saw writing as a mere symbol of speech. Semiotics and Logic. Derrida, along with Saussure, believes that semiotics does not depend on logic. He sees logic as another name for semiotics. So this makes logic weightless. In other words, he's saying that he believed that logic doesn't actually have, like when you learn the rules of logic, you think maybe that you are connecting to something deep in Platonic heaven, that's something in the metaphysical side of the world you're connecting to, that there are canons of logic out there in Platonic heaven. And Derrida is denying that, and he's saying it's just a convention. It's just a system of signs. It's something that we made up. Arch writing. This arch writing would be at work not only in the form and substance of graphic expression, but also in those of non-graphic expression. It is because arch writing, movement of difference, irreducible arch synthesis, opening in one and the same possibility, temporalization, as well as relationship with other and language, cannot, as the condition of all linguistic systems, form a part of the linguistic system itself and be situated as an object in its field. I have already begun to justify this word, and especially the necessity of the communication between the concept of arch writing and the vulgar concept of writing submitted to deconstruction by it. Arch writing as spacing cannot occur as such within the phenomenological experience of a presence. It marks the dead time within the presence of the living present within the general form of all presence. Author intention. Perhaps it is now easier to understand why Freud says of the dream work that it is comparable rather to a writing than to a language, and to a hieroglyphic rather than to a phonetic writing, and to understand why Saussure says of language that it is not a function of the speaker. With or without the complicity of their authors, all these propositions must be understood as more than the simple reversals of a metaphysics of presence or of conscious subjectivity. Trace. That is why a thought of the trace can no more break with a transcendental phenomenology than be reduced to it. The pure trace is difference. It does not depend on any sensible plenitude, audible or visible, phonic or graphic. It is, on the contrary, the condition of such a plenitude, although it does not exist, although it is never a being present outside of all plenitude. Its possibility is by rights anterior to all that one calls sign. I'd like to suggest that this is his concept of the trace is it's a window to his metaphysics. It's one of the ways that he has a metaphysics actually operating in the background. These chains and systems cannot be outlined except in the fabric of this trace or imprint. The unheard difference between the appearing and the appearance, between the world and lived experience, is the condition of all other differences, of all other traces, and it is already a trace. The trace is in fact the absolute origin of sense in general, which amounts to saying once again that there is no absolute origin of sense in general. The trace is the difference which opens appearance and signification. The trace is not more ideal than real, not more intelligible than sensible, not more transparent signification than an opaque energy, and no concept of metaphysics can describe it. End quote. That is what authorized us to call trace that which does not let itself be summed up in the simplicity of a present. The concepts of present, past, and future, everything in the concepts of time and history which implies evidence of them, the metaphysical concept of time in general, cannot adequately describe the structure of the trace. This deconstruction of presence accomplishes itself through the deconstruction of consciousness and therefore through the irreducible notion of the trace. So you can see he's using the trace as a metaphysical object that more or less takes the place of a lot of the function of metaphysics. The presence absence of the trace, which one should not even call its ambiguity, but rather its play, carries in itself the problems of the letter and the spirit, of body and soul, and of all the problems whose primary affinity I have recalled. The subordination of the trace to the full presence summed up in the Logos, the humbling of writing beneath speech, dreaming its plenitude, such are the gestures required by an ontotheology, determining the archaeological and eschatological meaning of being as presence, as parousia, as life without difference, another name for death, historical metamony, where God's name holds death in check, end quote. I know this sounds like a lot of gobbledygook, but you just have to take it in and let it percolate in your brain. What the thought of the trace has already taught us is that it could not be simply submitted to the ontophenomenological question of essence. The trace is nothing. It is not an entity. It exceeds the question, what is, and contingently makes it possible. Here one may no longer trust even the opposition of fact and principle, which in all of its metaphysical, ontological, and transcendental forms has always functioned within the system of what is. Writing is one of the representatives of the trace in general. It is not the trace itself. The trace does not exist. To exist is to be an entity, a being present, to on. Logos. That the Logos is first imprinted, and that imprint is the writing resource of language, signifies, to be sure, that the Logos is not creative activity, the continuous full element of the divine word, etc. But it would not mean a single step outside of metaphysics, if nothing more than a new motif of return to finitude, of God's death, etc., were the result of this move. It is that conceptuality and that problematics must be deconstructed. They belong to the ontotheology they must fight against. Difference is also something other than finitude. Derrida's philosophical theology. The Logos as self-presence is another name for God's infinite understanding. Derrida says that although structuralism would like to think that it has gone beyond logocentrism, instead it is still caught within it. The thing that distinguishes post-structuralism from structuralism is the deep structures of meaning claimed by structuralism. This post-structuralism denies. Derrida and Rousseau. Derrida seems to view Rousseau as in some sense the progenitor of his own view. He views Hegel as one of the last major theorists who promoted logocentrism. Recall that Rousseau had a Blue Lagoon view of the human condition. Rousseau believed that man in a primitive state was much better off than in a civilized state. Derrida maintains the thesis that writing is a type of violence. In support of this thesis, he cites the example of the Nambikwara tribe, which did not have writing and also did not exhibit violence. This is why Derrida can say that writing is a type of violence. A variant of this thesis is that when a culture acquires writing, it becomes vulnerable to propaganda, which is a type of violence. Derrida quotes Rousseau approvingly in that he condemns writing as destruction of presence and as disease of speech. To show his opposition to logocentrism, Derrida writes, quote, writing is dangerous from the moment that representation there claims to be presence and the sign of the thing itself, end quote. Again, citing Rousseau approvingly, Derrida says that according to Rousseau, the negativity of evil will always have the form of supplementarity. Evil is exterior to nature, to what is by nature innocent and good. It supervenes upon nature, but always by way of compensation for what ought to lack nothing at all in itself, end quote. Education, the keystone of Rousseauist thought, will be described or presented as a system of substitution destined to reconstitute nature's edifice in the most natural way possible. Derrida sees writing as what he calls a dangerous supplement to society, in a manner similar to Rousseau seeing botany as a dangerous supplement to the plant world. It is at this point that Derrida makes his famous statement, "There is nothing outside the text." This is essentially a denial that writing is capable of referencing things in the world or in Platonic heaven. Words can only refer to other words. Texts can only refer to other texts. From this, we infer that what Derrida means by dangerous supplement is the metaphysics of presence. On writing. Writing is the very process of the dispersal of peoples, unified as bodies, and the beginnings of their enslavement. Interesting. The body of a nation alone has authority over the spoken language, and the writers have the right over the written language. The people, Varro said, are not masters of writing as they are of speech. This view of writing seems to be in the spirit of Rousseau's preference for the primitive state. Remark on Rousseau's concept of the Blue Lagoon. Rousseau wants to believe that it is conventional education and civilization that results in the fall. The Bible teaches that it is rebellion against God and the denial that God exists that results in the fall. Derrida walls off God by denying that language can ever access metaphysics, meaning knowledge, math, scientific statements, and theology. It should also be noted that contemporary leftist approaches to education are grounded in Rousseau's Blue Lagoon anthropology. Theory of the origin of language. All language in general springs forth when passionate desire exceeds physical need, when imagination is awakened, which awakens pity and gives movement to the supplementary chain. Derrida begins to make a distinction between North and South. He says the South is the place of the origin of the cradle of languages, the origin or the cradle of languages. Thus, the Southern languages are closer to childhood. This is very Rousseauian. Closer to childhood, non-language, and nature, but at the same time, being closer to the origin, they are purer, more alive, and more animated. On the other hand, the Northern languages are distant from the origin, less pure, less alive, less warm. In them, one can follow the progress of death and coldness. Derrida probably is one of the major progenitors of the dichotomy within political correctness between so-called sun people versus ice people. He probably gets this proclivity from Rousseau. So I'm saying that Rousseau is probably one of the origins, if not the origin, of that dichotomy. I think it was pretty popular in the 90s, sun people versus ice people, which is a pretty racist attitude. And I would suggest that a lot of the racism that is going on now in critical race theory and critical whiteness studies comes from writers like Rousseau and also from Derrida in this way. Primitive language and supplementarity. Derrida appears to agree with Rousseau's Blue Lagoon philosophy of history and believes that there is a golden era when man had just enough linguistic capability to function, but not enough to have been polluted with the metaphysics of presence. In the primitive or pristine state, language can be described with the words nature, animality, primitivism, childhood, madness, divinity. In this regime, all concepts determining a non-supplementarity have evidently no truth value. Derrida describes supplementarity as a wrong term. He calls it the dislocation of the proper in general, the impossibility and therefore the desire of pure presence. The concept of man turns out to be self-delusion. Man calls himself man only by drawing limits, excluding his other from the play of supplementarity, the purity of nature, of animality, primitivism, childhood, madness, and divinity. All right, so let me make some observations about Derrida. Derrida is very French in his style of doing philosophy, meaning his style is continental, similar to Lyotard or Leotard in style and project. They are both difficult to follow. He is very unscientific. It appears that he has no formal scientific training, although he likes to dabble in cultural anthropology through the works of Rousseau, de Saussure, and Levi Strauss. And I read a bio on Derrida, and I think that he did at least his graduate work, or what you would call postgraduate work, in philosophy, but I don't know what his undergraduate work was in. Maybe he had a few courses in science, but he doesn't seem to know very much about science. We will see that his epistemology is anti-scientific. It is no surprise that science is currently being politicized in Western universities, partially due to his influence. His major work of grammatology goes all over the place. It has only a loose organization, again, a continental style. Derrida, continental, I'm saying continental as opposed to analytic. Those are the two major styles of philosophizing. Derrida likes to create multiplicities of distinctions which sound profound, but I think in many cases are just the product of his playful creativity. He also likes to create conceptual connections which exist in Derridian heaven, and I'm making a play on words because I'm saying he likes to put down Platonic heaven, but then he brings in his own Derridian heaven without admitting what he's doing, which exists in Derridian heaven, but at the same time he denies that the mind has access to objects in the real world or mathematical theorems in so-called Platonic heaven. Why should we reject metaphysics but stand idle while he imports his own metaphysics under the rubric grammatology? Grammatology is just Derrida's metaphysics. He's doing it in the name of philosophy of language, but he's really doing metaphysics. Okay, how Derrida contributes to nihilism. Derrida's concept of difference cuts off humans' ability to make statements about the world, science, math, logic, and God. In difference, words no longer describe the world. This imprisons man in his own immediate surroundings and cannot make substantive statements outside of his own immediate experience. It is a deep skepticism and leads to nihilism. How Derrida contributes to cultural relativism. Derrida adopts Rousseau's Blue Lagoon theology, so-called. Rousseau derides civilization itself as being the source of the fall, not rebellion against God. The Bible teaches that we have civilization only because God teaches us right from wrong. We are lost without the knowledge of God. So Rousseau and Derrida perfectly invert our understanding of what enables society to improve itself, or at least in Western consciousness. Derrida is in effect telling us that there is no source of knowledge to help us improve society, that it is an illusion. Also, it is civilization, the thing that Rousseau and Derrida deny, that represents our incremental progress in understanding what makes for a healthy society. The Rousseauist theme in Derrida will contribute to the multicultural denial that we can make value judgments about the relative goodness of social practices in those cultures. Therefore, we must passively accept the status quo. How Derrida contributes to atheism. By denying the metaphysics of presence, Derrida denies metaphysics itself. Since God lives in the realm of metaphysics, God is walled off as a mere fantasy, or as a posit. We could call it a posit that has no basis. The denial of the metaphysics of presence, i.e. the denial of logocentrism, is the denial that we can make any statements about math, logic, and God. It also denies science because Derrida can always deny that any amount of experimental evidence could be taken as evidence for his scientific theories. In fact, scientific theories, insofar as they make global statements about the world, cannot be made by us because they assume a connection between observational statements and global statements about the world, or let's say about a world. So we cannot make statements about God's creation. Then we cannot appreciate and worship the Creator as the Creator. We are mired in atheism. Okay, let me end here with an advertisement for my eBooks. I want to invite you to order some of my eBooks. I have 7 eBooks for sale. There's my email address at the bottom. If you are interested in any of these titles, please email me at that address. I'll give you a price list and order information. All right? Thank you so much for listening. This is Son of Freedom.